food, drugs, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. The full version of this episode is available to paid subscribers at the Mind and Matter Substack at mindandmatter.substack.com. The full version is also freely available on my YouTube page. Just look up Mind and Matter or my name, Nick Jikomis, on YouTube, and you'll find the episode there. This is a partial version of the episode, and so it'll cut off partway through, but you'll still get a significant portion. So sign up to become a paid subscriber at Substack or visit my YouTube page to get the full episode. Can you take a moment to just introduce yourself to everyone and tell us what you do and what your lab studies?
My name is Vlad Vyazovskiy. I'm a professor of sleep physiology at the Department of Physiology, Anatomy and Genetics at Oxford University. So I've been here for about 12 years now. So I lead a research group with, as usual, with students, postdocs. We are studying sleep. We are studying neurobiology of sleep. But we are addressing this from different sides, from different angles. So we are trying to make sense of what happens in the brain when animals are sleeping. We are looking into questions such as why do we sleep, what sleep is about, what the function of sleep is. And I look at some other states which are related to sleep or connected in some ways. For example, we are working with a model of a torpor. A torpor is a hypometabolic state. So I work with hamsters who spend some time during the winter in this very interesting state called torpor. I also work a bit with psychedelics. So we have another project where we're looking at effects of substances like 5-MeO-DMT on brain activity and behavior, also in mice.
And so on your lab website, you start off by sort of giving a reason for why you're studying sleep and why it's interesting and all of that. And you say that, despite the exponential growth in what we've learned about sleep in the past few decades, it has not brought us closer to understanding what sleep is about in the first place, and that there is no theory of sleep yet. So can you just talk about that for a minute? What do you mean when you say things like we don't actually understand why animals sleep in the first place? Is it truly still a complete mystery, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, you will be surprised, of course, to hear, and many of your listeners, that we are still a bit in the darkness about why sleep is there. When we talk about the famous "why do we sleep" question, why has two sides. Is how come? We're talking here about regulation and mechanisms of sleep. So why sleep is there in the first place, or evolutionary origin, and another is biological purpose of sleep. So why do we sleep? Here we're talking about what's the benefit. So why do you need to sacrifice such a big chunk of your life for this very, very, very strange, very bizarre state? If you go to a sleep meeting, so there are many conferences happening on sleep. You talk to experts who spend some time, their entire career studying sleep, and it's very common that you sit down and start talking about trying to define what sleep is. So this is actually one of my favorite subjects or topics. So if you start dissecting, the closer you look at sleep, the less you understand what is it exactly that you're studying. And I think this is the main problem, and this is why we do not have a theory. We have very few theoretical frameworks in the field that would allow us to to make good progress in this question.
Mhm. Well, I guess, naively, many people would say, well, obviously the point of sleep is it's recuperative. You need to sleep in order for your brain to function properly. But I guess maybe what you might say is, well, yes, but what exactly are you recuperating? What exactly in the neurons and in the cells of the brain and body needs this offline state to happen?
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. This is one of the mainstream directions in sleep research. The idea is that sleep is the price to pay for wakefulness. So you spend time awake, your brain is working hard, your body is working, it's active in many different ways. And then you need a restoration. You need restoration, recuperation, and this is what sleep is providing. So there is, of course, a lot of evidence that something like this may be happening indeed, but we have, on the other hand, many examples of animals sleeping most of 24 hours, really sleeping a lot, which is very difficult to reconcile with the idea that sleep is just to provide restoration or recuperation.
Hmm.
So I think there is just no way around. We must take it at the next level, and indeed, as you said, try to understand what is this restoration is about. It must be some kind of very advanced, very specialized, very elaborate way of restoration that only sleep can provide, right? Or another way, and we can talk more about this, the idea that sleep is a default state of the organism. So you spend your life asleep and you just wake up to satisfy your immediate needs, and then you go back to sleep. So you can turn this entire thing upside down. Sleep basically fills your time when you don't need to be awake.
Hmm. And I suppose, the counter arguments to that would be that animals clearly spend quite a bit of time doing things that don't directly involve addressing their immediate needs, and humans would be a great example of one such a creature.
Humans are, I think, the worst experimental subjects you can imagine. Yeah. We probably don't need to be awake all the time that we are awake. Yes, we are somehow programmed spending our 7 or 8 hours asleep. Some of us can sleep much longer, but we have this approximately 7 or 8 hours, and then we have the rest of the time, 16 hours to do something. Most of us find something to keep ourselves busy, but also I think humans is the only species who can get bored, right? When there is nothing to do, you get bored and you suffer from that, and you're trying to find what is it to occupy yourself
Yeah.
with.
Well, I mean, I can think of
Animals.
I
Hmm?
can think of a little child, right? When little children always say that they're bored, and they don't just stop and go to sleep every time they feel bored. They do the opposite.
Mhm. Yes, yeah. Well, this is of course a separate question about early development and early
Mm.
age, where sleep and wake have actually somewhat different meaning or potentially different meaning.
Hmm. And maybe we should just start a little bit high level. On the one hand, we all know what sleep is from experience, but as a scientist, as someone who's studying this in the lab, studying it across species and so forth, how do you define sleep versus wakefulness? What are the key sort of pillars of what defines sleep?
Mhm. Yeah, sleep is by and large a behavioral state. I think this is probably the best and convenient way to start defining sleep. Sleep is defined behaviorally, and there are several criteria that were invented a long time ago. And this is, first of all, immobility or relative immobility. You move less or you don't move when you're asleep. You are also less responsive to the stimuli, or to put it slightly differently, I need to apply stronger stimulus to elicit a response, which again is a very interesting subject, and we can talk more about this if it is true or not. And then yeah, if you look at different animals, we have a variety of specializations. So many animals have a specific sleeping site, specific sleeping posture, and so on. So and all these defining criteria, they are explicitly behavior and brain centric. So this is a very convenient way to approach the question. If you look at a sleeping human or sleeping animal, in most cases you just know that they're sleeping, and this is when it becomes difficult because it's always, if you have a dog, that the dog may look sleeping, and then you slam the door very quietly, shut the door quiet, and the animal turns the ear. And then you really start, okay, is there someone there or not? Is the dog actually sleeping, or is it's then monitoring the environment? And this is when it becomes very difficult. Or on the other hand, there are many cases when animals can be asleep um, uh, uh, based on brain activity, but engaging in movement. Again, talking about dogs, it's well known that they can twitch a lot, they can almost run when they're in the state called paradoxical sleep or rapid eye movement sleep. Again, is it sleep, or is it what kind of sleep is that? This is when it becomes a bit more difficult.
Hmm.
And then another yes,
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
and then another level is what happens in the brain. We are using an approach called polysomnography in humans, and we can use a similar approach of recording brain waves, EEG, electroencephalogram, and some other signals also in animals. The first recording of whole night polysomnography was performed somewhere in 1960s in Stanford, but EEG as approach and sleep recordings with EEG were invented much earlier. And this is when scientists noticed that something is very different happens in the brain. When you look at brain waves of an awake subject and a sleeping subject, it looks different. It just looks different visually. And then a whole night recording of sleep was obtained at some point, and this is when you also realize that there is a lot of complexity, a lot of heterogeneity during the night. So there are two different states of sleep, at least two different states of sleep, non-rapid eye movement sleep and REM sleep, and they changed about 4 or 5 cycles in humans. There are many, many more in animals, like in a laboratory mouse, it could be 50 cycles, which are very short, they're like 10 minutes long. And brain activity may look especially during non-REM sleep, very different from wake. During a REM sleep, brain activity can look very similar to wakefulness. But again, there is a lot of overlap. So when you're tired, when you're sleep deprived, your brain activity may start looking more like a sleep than awake.
Hmm.
So these are probably just to sum up two main approaches we use to define sleep. One is the behavioral state of inactivity and reduced responsiveness. Another is a different brain state where neural networks enter a different state and produce different kinds of oscillations.
Yeah. So at one level, we can define sleep behaviorally. It has to do with the extent to which the animal is behaving in its environment, reacting to external stimuli. But below that, if you start digging into what the brain is actually doing, there are multiple brain states within that one behavioral state that we can call sleep. And even though behaviorally animals are relatively quiescent, relatively inactive, there are exceptions to that to some extent. You mentioned, the dog sort of moving while it's sleeping. There are other examples we might talk about later where animals are moving around in more impressive ways. You can even think about things like sleepwalking, which occasionally happen in humans. But obviously, there's something different about the brain state beneath that when those animals are asleep behaviorally. And so there's a lot to dig in here. But on the question of whether sleep is primarily or exclusively about the brain and about neurons, is there, one way to get at that question, I suppose, is there any kind of lawful relationship between, say, the amount of neural tissue an animal has and the extent to which it sleeps? Do animals with bigger brains sleep more? Is there even something like sleep or behavioral quiescence in non-neural systems?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. These are great questions and legitimate questions, of course. And but there is a big problem with kind of this way of looking to at sleep, which is in fact very common. So first of all, we start with this concept of sleep, but I don't think there is like a unitary biological phenomenon which is equated to this label.
Mm.
So there is a lot of complexity behind. To the extent that indeed we started talking now about this phenomenon of so-called local sleep or sleep at the level of neuronal assemblies or neuronal groups. So there's a lot of interest and a lot of research into this possibility that sleep does not even require the whole organism. That some very essential features of sleep can be found at the level of a neuron, even neuronal culture in a dish. So we have this preparation, so-called sleep in a dish, that several labs are working on. That if you put neurons together, they establish some connectivity and they start oscillating. They start producing type of activity very similar in some ways to what happens during sleep. So this means that, or another interesting preparation that was developed by a colleague in Canada. So it's an isolated cortical slab. When a piece of the cortex was undercut, you cut the white matter that provides these inputs and outputs to this gray matter on the top. And you still make sure that there is blood supply to this island of cortex. And then you let it be there in situ, in the brain. So the animal is behaving, running around, doing stuff. And that part of the brain is disconnected, right? So it exists just by itself. So first, it starts producing very, very abnormal activity, like a burst suppression, like when you're in a coma, in very deep coma or very deep anesthesia. But then after some time, after some days, it starts producing very beautiful, well-defined slow waves. The very slow waves we use to define sleep at the level of the whole brain. And then that piece of the cortex doesn't care what the rest of the animal is doing. The animal, for example, the animal goes between non-REM and REM sleep, where brain activity is very different, but this small piece of cortex is staying in non-REM sleep. So
it's in non-REM sleep continuously, always?
Continuously, yeah. Continuously for a long period of time. I don't remember for how long they were able to monitor activity in this isolated cortical slab, as they called it. But this led to this very, very interesting idea that you don't need the organism, you don't even need the brain to produce the type of activity that we use to define sleep. Right? So you see the problem is, right?
Yeah. So what you're saying is, so you can take an animal, scientists have done this, you can do a surgery on the animals to isolate one chunk of its brain from the rest of the brain. You basically just cut connections so that this one chunk of tissue in an intact brain, intact animal, is no longer talking to the rest of the brain, but still gets blood supply. It's still alive. It's still there. And it will basically look like it's asleep, even though the animal's awake and the other parts of the brain are doing other things. And then you can even take it further, you said. So you can have neurons growing in a petri dish. Now you no longer have a brain. You no longer have an animal or an organism that tissue is attached to. And the neurons, even in that highly reduced state, will still oscillate in ways that sort of look like the rhythmic activity you see in sleep.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So this neuron, where this spontaneous activity is coming from, is another question that scientists are trying to clarify. So there could be some intrinsic properties. So these neurons have a certain array of ionic channels that there is plasticity within this network, and the spontaneous activity can emerge from the configuration of this network. For example, if the neuronal population stays silent, we call it hyperpolarized. That means that the membrane potential is very low. And then this would activate certain ionic channels, which are activated just by being in that state and being hyperpolarized state. And they start passing sodium inside the cell, which would depolarize the cell. And this would eventually lead to the burst of activity. And so on. So some spontaneous activity, like in the heart. So the mechanisms are actually remarkably similar to what happens in the heart, which can also beat without any input, any neuronal, any nerve,
External input.
External input.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So no stimulation is required for the heart to beat. So it's autonomous to some extent. Maybe when we are talking about this isolated cortical slab, it exists like that. Like this island of activity, like an I'm trying to find the right. I don't want to compare it to the heart, but the mechanisms could be actually quite similar.
I guess the idea here is that this sort of ties, I guess, at some level to the idea that sleep could be a default state in the sense that based purely on the intrinsic properties of neurons, so the types of proteins they have, the types of ion channels they have, in the absence of adding anything by injecting activity into these by having sensory organs like your eyes and your ears and everything, even when we think about something like the heart, it's a contractile organ. It's a very rhythmic organ. It does this automatically and spontaneously without any sort of extra input. I guess the idea here would be that neurons might just sort of intrinsically at baseline be these sort of rhythmic type of cells that, based purely on their biophysical properties and the way that their ion channels work and things like this, they might sort of by default have this sort of rhythmicity to their behavior.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is the idea that neurons that may not necessarily be the property of all neurons in the brain. So maybe some parts of the brain or some types of neurons are more likely to engage in this kind of activity. But this is really a very, very fundamental kind of property, and again, a good starting point for this discussion that neurons do have this capacity to produce the type of activity that we believe are characteristic for sleep.
Mm-hmm.
But then maybe going back to your question, one of the problems. So you're saying whether you need the entire brain, if you need the nervous system, and so on. The problem is that our defining criteria for sleep, as I mentioned, they're explicitly brain-centric. They are brain-centric, brain and behavior-centric, right? So whether that you stop moving, you stop responding, you take a posture, you engage in some preparatory behaviors to sleep. So this is all brain. So we would always forget about the rest of the body, which is curious. It may be not as easy to monitor, or it's more difficult to make sense out of what happens on the periphery, although a lot is happening during sleep on the periphery. There is growth hormone increases massively during sleep, but we kind of conveniently kind of leave it aside, and we are focused on the brain because we define sleep by brain-centric criteria. And it's very difficult to get out of this kind of loop when you don't have vocabulary to talk about sleep with respect to what happens in the gut. Very few scientists kind of were brave enough to go in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess, even if I sort of, you mentioned that you can grow neurons in a dish and they will display activity patterns that are rhythmic and are reminiscent of the patterns you see in the brain of intact organisms. What if you have just non-neural systems? What if you just have cells in a dish or some kind of organism that doesn't have neurons at all? Are there similar rhythms in biology that we see in non-neural systems, maybe patterns of gene expression that wax and wane throughout the day that are, is it possible that sort of these rhythms are even more fundamental than neurons themselves?
Well, there will be many similarities among neuronal and non-neuronal cells, even if we talk about the brain, like astrocytes or some glia cells. So as far as we know, astrocytes cannot produce action potentials. So, or they're not electrically excitable cells, but certainly they have membrane potential. So they have potential across the membrane, which is very important. There's all cells in the body and in all organisms, including plants. There is always membrane potential that determines a lot of properties of the cell. Even though relatively few cells, as far as we know, now can produce what we call action potentials. This is what characterizes neurons and some other tissues like cardiac tissue. But then, you can definitely find similarities and differences. If you look at the transcriptome of different cell types, you can cluster different tissues based on the array of genes which are expressed in those tissues. What to make out of that is probably a separate question, right? So what is it that endows that tissue with properties that we believe is important for sleep, right? But I think we need to be careful with this approach because separating, kind of subdividing into different organs, cell types, and so on will inevitably artificial. So we can make some conclusions, but anyway, we have to put the system together to understand how it works. Like with neurons and astrocytes, neurons cannot really uh, exist without glia, right? So there are many fundamental properties of the brain, of the neural networks, will not be possible without oligodendrocytes that produce myelin, or astrocytes, which are very important in kind of recycling potassium or glutamate. So we need to be careful with kind of taken out of the context.
Mhm. And obviously we can think about sleep in our own lives because we all have to we all have to sleep, and we're very familiar with it in that way. And we can observe other animals. You were talking about dogs. We can talk about a number of other species, and clearly they sleep too. Any animal with a big brain. What are sort of the simplest animals and model systems in which there clearly is something like a sleep-like state? Do fruit flies or C. elegans worms living in the soil, do these sorts of smaller, simpler organisms that don't have such a big, elaborate brain like a mammal, do they also sleep or have some kind of sleep-like state?
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned the sleep-like state, because of course our initial criteria for defining sleep were developed for mammals. And then the further away you go from mammals, from large animals, the more difficult it becomes to apply the same criteria. For example, there is a big debate now in the literature whether reptiles, such as lizards, if they have REM sleep, because we are trying to enforce the criteria that were developed for mammals to a very, very different organism. And the same applies to sleep in general. But this is why behavioral criteria started with this reduced responsiveness, immobility, and also ability to compensate for lost sleep. We call it sleep homeostasis, are quite universal. So they're found across probably all or most living creatures, living organisms, speaking about animals right now, that were studied. I don't know what is the simplest organism that has been studied. I believe it's Hydra, jellyfish. So the what we are now discovering is that you don't even need a brain. You don't need the brain to sleep. You don't even need a nervous system technically, right? So as long as probably you need some excitable tissues, but certainly you don't need the brain in our usual understanding of what brain is, to produce a state that we would call sleep.
Hmm. Interesting. And so I want to get back to this issue of sleep as a local versus global phenomenon. So if we just limit ourselves to thinking about animals with well-defined big brains, relatively speaking, we think about an animal like mammals, like humans, and we've got a big brain, we've got a cerebral cortex. Most of the time, obviously, sleep is globally regulated. Like I go to sleep, my whole my whole person all at once, pretty much every night. But there are other animals that start to give us an indication that sleep doesn't need to be a whole brain phenomenon. So, for example, I believe certain marine mammals can sort of sleep one side of the brain and then the other side of the brain. And so, like dolphins or sea lions and animals like this, I believe have been observed to sort of swim in a circle. And while one half of their brain is asleep, and then the other half can go asleep separately. So that starts to indicate that sleep doesn't need to be a whole brain phenomenon. But how far can you take this in natural conditions? You mentioned the surgical conditions that where we've seen local brain tissue sort of go to sleep or go into a sleep-like state when scientists manipulate the brain. But how local can natural sleep be in a fully intact animal?
Yeah, dolphins, a unihemispheric sleep in dolphins was, of course, a very, very, very interesting, very important discovery for the field. It's somewhat an extreme adaptation, as far as we know. I don't think we such a degree of laterality or locality was found in any other organisms except marine mammals. So
Mm-hmm.
the same unihemispheric phenomenon of unihemispheric sleep was observed in several species of cetaceans and in some seals, although not all. And this is obviously extremely interesting, unique, and we still don't understand how exactly it is regulated and how it is controlled. But as far as we know, and I really wouldn't be surprised if it is a very common, very widespread phenomenon, is that sleep is fundamentally local process.
Hmm.
Even if you say that you're sleeping your entire organism or your entire body or the brain, it's very easy if I put a lot of electrodes in your brain, and I definitely find some neurons which are active, which are more active than others.
Hmm.
You can look at occurrence of slow waves, which we already discussed earlier, which is a very important characteristic of sleep. And a colleague of mine, Yuval Nir, and several other labs looked at with many electrodes in patients who were implanted with depth electrodes because of course, for diagnostic purposes, they were patients with epilepsy. And you rarely or never find that the entire brain is experiencing a slow wave at the same time.
Hmm.
It is always slow waves in one part of the brain, and just a few millimeters or centimeters away, you don't have any slow wave. Even in a small brain like a mouse, so we also implant multiple electrodes, and even in this tiny brain, we find a lot of diversity. So the mouse brain never asleep at the same time everywhere. It's really like a degree. It's
Hmm.
the correct approach is to say not that you're awake and asleep, but to what percentage of your brain is asleep or awake. Maybe this is
I
one
see.
way.
So even though an animal is might be behaviorally asleep, I can go lay down in my bed and fall asleep. You're saying that if you were to measure the activity in different chunks of cortical tissue in the brain, much of the brain would be asleep, say in non-REM sleep, and you would see the slow waves and things like this. But you could have another chunk of tissue in the same animal in the same brain, very close by, and it basically is awake. It looks like the neurons are in an awake animal, effectively.
Mhm. Yeah, and yeah, exactly. And this represents an interesting kind of conundrum. So, does it mean that our approach to define sleep using these readouts of EEG or brain activity just inadequate,
Mm.
right? Or we are just missing something? There is a great example is a condition called paradoxical insomnia. So I'm not a clinician. I'm sure clinicians can tell you much more interesting stories. But the argument goes that these patients, they may uh, uh, spend a beautiful night sleeping according to objective measures, according to our EEG recordings, and claim that they barely slept.
Hmm.
And then you show them the recording and say, no, you're lying. You spend 7 hours of you're sleeping better than I do. And they will say, no, I feel miserable. It was terrible. It was the worst night ever. So what do we make out of that? And it's interesting that this condition is called paradoxical insomnia or sleep state misperception.
Huh.
But it's almost like ridiculous, you know. So we are saying that the patient, so they are misperceiving their sleep.
Yes.
It's like we know better. So
Yeah. Yeah.
we record their brain waves and say
Yeah.
you
We're
are
assuming
sleeping.
we're assuming that that measurement is truly a faithful readout of their state.
Exactly. What
Yeah.
is, yeah, exactly. So what is the true measurements? What is more important, objective or subjective? And talking about sleep, there is actually a very poor correlation between objective measures of sleep and subjective measures.
Huh.
There are really nice studies which suggest that if you wake up the patient, the subject, and then you just ask them to reflect on how deep their sleep was. This is why actually I try to avoid this terminology of sleep depth because it's really misleading,
Hmm.
you know. And they would say, yeah, my sleep was really superficial, or someone would say, my sleep was so deep, yeah, I didn't exist at all, and it does not correlate really with slow wave activity. If anything,
Hmm.
it's the opposite.
Wow. Yeah, normally
But
normally when people talk about this, we talk about non-REM sleep having multiple stages. There's so-called deep sleep with slow waves. And the way that people talk about it implies that the more slow wave sleep you get, the more depth you had in your sleep, and therefore the more rested you should feel.
yeah, exactly. That's the kind of the approach, and I think where it's coming from, we love metaphors when we talk about
Mm,
sleep, sleep depth. It's very intuitive, right? So deep sleep meaning very
yeah.
restorative sleep when you're recovering and you're impossible to wake up. And indeed, like very early studies, they do suggest that you need to apply a stronger stimulus early in the night to elicit a response. Right? And this would correlate with what happens with slow wave activity across the night, because slow wave activity is always highest early in the night in the first cycle, and then it goes lower, lower, lower. It describes this so-called process S that we can also discuss. And but it's much more complicated than that. So if you look at these measures very closely, then if I try to systematically wake you up at different stages, then you may be as difficult to elicit a response during rapid eye movement sleep. Well, when there is no slow wave activity or much less. Right, but the arousal threshold, how we call it, can be similar to state with a lot of slow waves.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so if you so sleep depth is not a great terminology.
I see. Yeah. Yeah. I guess that's always important to remind ourselves that this is terminology. These are linguistic terms or even metaphors
Mm.
that we're coming up with to try and understand things, but we are imposing them on something that we only have a fuzzy grasp on. And I suppose another thing that's coming to mind here for me is that there are various pharmacological interventions where, you give people certain drugs and it completely changes their sleep architecture, but it doesn't necessarily result in subjective changes in sleep quality that you might expect. So, for example, um, my understanding is that drugs like SSRIs reduce REM sleep, and therefore you have more non-REM sleep, say. But if you have a drug that's making that kind of drastic change, you don't normally hear people say like, "Oh, well, I don't have good sleep, or I have extremely good sleep now." So the sleep architecture does seem to be dissociable from the subjectively felt quality of sleep, which I suppose would imply that, this is just me thinking out loud here. Whatever cell biological mechanisms that underlie the recuperative function of sleep, they might be dissociable from the brain waves and things that we measure to characterize sleep normally.
Yeah, absolutely. SSRIs or monoamine oxidase inhibitors, these are antidepressants that indeed have quite a profound effect on sleep. You're saying they can suppress or eliminate rapid eye movement sleep altogether. But again, this it may also suggest that the defining criteria for REM sleep that we use, they are maybe insufficient or suboptimal to some extent, right? So how do we define REM sleep?
Mm-hmm.
So there is activated EEG, eye movements, and also muscle atonia,
Mm-hmm.
right? There are also some other phasic phenomena, but muscle atonia can also happen during non-REM sleep.
Hmm.
So what may be happening with SSRIs is that some essential features of REM sleep simply merging into non-REM sleep and they become less detectable. So we should,
Mm.
of course, I don't want to invent some
Yeah.
explanation that is very difficult to test, but we should be always be open to this possibility, knowing that this property of sleep that is always like a mixture of different states, and sleep is very dynamic
Yeah. Yeah.
state.
Yeah, and I guess that makes a lot of sense intuitively. Like these are pretty coarse-grained measures. When you talk about something like non-REM versus REM sleep, these are defined by the EEG largely. And basically what you're saying is there's probably lots of different components to each state under normal conditions, and it is possible under other conditions to sort of mix and match those components in ways that, just because you have a suppression of the EEG signal normally associated with REM sleep doesn't mean that everything that underlies that state goes away.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. And again, here we are just talking about humans.
Yeah.
And this is why it's so important and so interesting to look at how different other animals sleep,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because this is when you realize that what we think is important for humans, for sleep being restorative, may be completely irrelevant or not the case at all in other animals,
Hmm. What,
right? We
what,
are. Mhm.
what would be an example of that?
Yeah, one example. Okay, sleep cycle. In humans we have, uh, as I mentioned, 4 or 5 non-REM cycles. All right. If you look at birds, many birds have much less REM sleep.
Hmm.
Uh, on the other hand, they may have just very brief, like a few seconds lasting episodes of sleep, which we can with some certainty label REM sleep. But some other animals, like ferrets, may have 45% of their sleep time, like almost half of their sleep time is in REM sleep, and they also have two different kinds of REM sleep.
Hmm.
I mean, we call them two different types of REM sleep. It was described by a couple of labs. Actually, I was involved also in a collaboration here in Oxford. We recorded sleep in ferrets. So they do have 3 sleep stages, not non-REM and REM sleep, but they have distinct 3 sleep stages.
Hmm.
We don't know what to do about that. Okay, does it mean that their sleep is more restorative, or like, right? If you see where I'm going, so
Yeah,
we don't
yeah.
know what's the meaning of these features of sleep which we believe are important.
Yeah, yeah. It's just I guess basically what you're saying in essence is, we've come up with these terms using things like EEG patterns, things like behavioral criteria, non-REM sleep, REM sleep, deep sleep, slow. Like we have all of these terms to describe these things, and they map onto some criteria, but we don't actually have a firm handle about how all of those objective measures actually relate to what's happening for the organism, the underlying function. And so we can't simply look at an animal and be like, they've got this much REM sleep, therefore they are sleeping more deeply or less deeply or whatever.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. And this is why it's really important that we look beyond our human species
Mm-hmm.
at other species. There was another series of studies lately in like very unconventional animals that some labs are now actually venturing into the wild. They managed to capture those animals, even put electrodes, and then they have to recapture them to retrieve their devices. And I'm talking about one study, for example, about sleeping penguins. I don't know if you heard of that. So it was published last year, I believe, and together with my former graduate students, we all wrote an editorial on that. It was in the Science magazine, and the study was led by Paul Antoine Liburel. So he's a very talented engineer. So this is exactly who we need in our field, who he actually knows what he's doing when he's implanting electrodes and recording electrical signals. So he goes to Antarctica. They capture penguins. They implant electrodes. And penguins, they live in these big colonies,
Yeah.
thousands of birds, and they're sitting on the eggs, and then they have chicks. They have to defend them because they're trying to steal nesting material from each other. There are some predator birds who
Mm.
also want to do
So it's to
to
stay
eat.
awake, I would imagine, for long periods.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. How can you sleep if you're in this environment? So what do you think these birds are doing? Any thoughts? Any ideas?
I mean, the first thought that comes to my mind is perhaps it's something akin to the local sleep phenomena we talked about before, where they can maintain behavioral vigilance to some extent, but part of their brain goes offline for some amount of time, but not the whole thing.
Yeah, they do. They do some of that, but overall, they basically never engage in a consolidated sleep.
Hmm.
So they accumulate actually quite a lot of sleep if you sum up all these micro episodes. They call them micro sleeps,
Hmm.
lasting just a few seconds at a time. So basically, they're dozing off like
They
that.
doze off many, many,
Yeah.
many times.
Yeah. But they basically, on average, they almost always vigilant, and they're watching what is going on. So their sleep is kind of fundamentally different from how we sleep and how we think sleep should be.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, when I can, everyone can probably think of their own life of cases where they're sleep deprived, they haven't slept in a while. You start to doze off a little bit, and you can doze off. I mean, there's been cases in my life where I'm traveling in airports or whatever, And you doze off multiple times, but it doesn't feel recuperative. It certainly doesn't feel like you could last for days and days in that way.
Yeah, exactly. But you see, this is one of those unique adaptations, like with dolphins,
Yeah.
because the simplest thing, again, this is how argument goes. The simplest thing would be just to get rid of sleep altogether, right?
Right.
If sleep were not important. But animals develop these unique adaptations, like unihemispheric sleep, or like this sleep split into thousands and thousands of microsleeps. I mean, of course, our definitions of sleep break down completely. This means that sleep can come in many different forms, but it also tells us something very fundamental, that sleep must be there one way or another. It has some function, it has some role. Because otherwise, I mean, the only alternative explanation, as I mentioned at the
Yeah.
beginning, is that sleep is just a default state. You always gravitate to the sleep state. If there is nothing else to do, no stimulation, you go to this default mode. And what you are, it's not like you're dozing off and you just go back to sleep, right?
Yeah.
So when you can afford.
Yeah. And I guess, if I step back for a second, I think by analogy with like other fundamental drives that organisms have that, we understand more, all animals need to, I'm just going to talk about animals for now, but this is even deeper than that. All animals need to create energy, right? We all have to, our cells need ATP. We need to ingest material from the outside environment. We need to eat. We need to obtain nutrition and calories. And we understand that at some level, right? We know that animals need to eat because we need to make ATP, and we've worked out at the cellular level, sort of what the mechanisms there are. We know that there's, an electron transport chain in our mitochondria. We understand that our cells need to make ATP molecules because that's going to be the energy currency that enables our cells to function. So there's sort of a fundamental cell biological explanation for why animals need to ingest food from the environment. But if you didn't know that yet, and you were just looking at animals and you were completely naive about all of that stuff, obviously all animals are ingesting things, but they're doing it in radically different ways. And sort of what you're started to tell us is that all animals do need sleep, but they do it in radically different ways. Sometimes you've got 1,000 microsleep environments in a penguin. Sometimes you've got, a single 7 to 8 hour session in a human. And there's all of these different ways to sleep. But I would think that there must be some kind of fundamental cell biological essence to sleep that is a common denominator here. And I'd love, is that the way you think about it? And if so, is that really what the mystery is still?
Yeah, this is the main mystery, and this is the main question. So we start with this observation that all or most animals sleep in some way, and therefore the argument goes, and you do this at the expense of other very important things. So there must be a reason for that.
Full version of this episode is available to paid subscribers at the Mind and Matter Substack at mindandmatter.substack.com. The full version is also freely available on my YouTube page. Just look up Mind and Matter or my name, Nick Jikomis, on YouTube, and you'll find the episode there. This is a partial version of the episode, and so it'll cut off partway through, but you'll still get a significant portion. So sign up to become a paid subscriber at Substack or visit my YouTube page to get the full episode. This episode is supported in part by Athletic Greens. Their main product, AG1, is a comprehensive and convenient daily nutrition product containing 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients with less than 1 gram of sugar per serving, no nasty chemicals or artificial anything. It's gluten and dairy free and compatible with paleo, vegan, vegetarian, and ketogenic diets. AG1 is a quick and convenient way to supplement your diet to help ensure your body is getting the nutrients it needs. It comes in powder form, and you can mix it in water and drink it, or you can put it into a smoothie or a shake or something like that. I mix it into water and drink it, and it's super convenient. If you go to athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter, Athletic Greens will give you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Their vitamin D product comes in tincture form, so you just take 1 drop each day. A large fraction of the population is actually vitamin D deficient, especially in winter months when we get less sun exposure. And vitamin D is super important for the proper function of the immune system, and for a variety of other things. So visit athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter or click the link in the episode description. You'll get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D with your first purchase.